A desperate father's trembling hands reached for baby formula, knowing he couldn't pay for it. But what the store clerk did next would restore your faith in humanity forever. But what nobody expected was that this single moment of compassion would expose a web of corporate greed that had been systematically destroying families for decades. 3-year-old Tommy hadn't eaten properly in 4 days. His father, a former construction worker whose injury had left him unable to work, stood in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a corner store at 11:47 p.m., holding a can of formula that cost more than his weekly food budget. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd once built the very buildings that now housed the businesses he could no longer afford to shop at. This wasn't just about one desperate father. This was about a system designed to push working families into impossible choices. Feed your child or pay rent. Buy medicine or buy food. The same system that had convinced society that poverty was a personal failing, not a structural injustice. As surveillance cameras captured every agonizing second, this man faced the ultimate test of a parent's love. Would he walk away and let his child suffer? Or would he cross a line that society had drawn between the deserving and undeserving poor? The clerk behind the counter, a father of 2 working double shifts to make ends meet, watched this scene unfold with recognition in his eyes. He knew that desperation, that crushing weight of watching your child suffer while society looked the other way. He could follow protocol, protect his job, and turn away from another parent's pain. Or he could make a choice that would challenge everything we think we know about solidarity among the struggling. If you believe that kindness still exists in this world, smash that like button right now. Comment faith in humanity if you're ready to see how one moment of compassion can change everything. Subscribe because what happens next will prove that heroes don't wear capes. They wear name tags and work night shifts. This story will shatter your assumptions about poverty, generosity, and the power of human connection. Because sometimes the people with the least to give are the ones who give the most. But to understand how this moment became a catalyst for change that would impact thousands of families, I need to take you back to where it all began. James Rivera had once been the kind of man who never asked for help. At 32, he had built his reputation one brick at a time, literally. For 8 years, he was the go-to foreman for Richardson Construction. The guy who could solve any structural problem, who showed up before dawn and left after sunset. His calloused hands had shaped the skyline of his city, and his paycheck had shaped a comfortable life for his family. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. A scaffolding collapse on the 32nd floor of a luxury apartment complex, the kind of building where the cheapest unit costs more than James made in 3 years. Vertebrae crushed, nerves damaged, dreams shattered. The doctors said he'd walk again, but heavy lifting construction work. Find a new career path, they said, as if starting over at 32 with a 3-year-old son was as simple as changing clothes. Workers' compensation covered the medical bills. Barely, but the fine print that nobody reads until it's too late revealed the cruel mathematics of corporate protection, temporary disability, payments that wouldn't cover rent in the city he'd helped build. James had fallen through the cracks of a system designed to protect companies, not workers. The discrimination started immediately. Construction worker on a resume became a scarlet letter in office environments. Employers saw his hands still, bearing the permanent stains of concrete and steel, and made assumptions. Overqualified, they'd say, about retail positions, underqualified for anything requiring computer skills. The few interviews he managed felt like performances where he had to prove he belonged in their world. 3 months after the accident, the eviction notice arrived. 6 months later, James found himself in a studio apartment in the poorest part of town, watching his son play with toys from the dollar store while calculating whether they could afford both dinner and breakfast. The man who had built homes for others was now struggling to keep his own. But James had no idea that his greatest test was still approaching. Because on this particular November night, with $3.47 in his wallet and an empty refrigerator at home, he would discover that sometimes our lowest moments create the conditions for the most extraordinary human connections. As he walked through those store doors at 11:47 p.m., James Rivera was about to learn that the distance between desperation and hope is sometimes just one act of unexpected kindness. The system that had failed, James Rivera wasn't faceless. It had names, offices, and profit margins. At the top sat Charles Whitman, CEO of Whitman Holdings, the parent company that owned Richardson Construction, along with dozens of other businesses. Designed to extract maximum profit from minimum investment in human welfare, Whitman had built his empire on a simple philosophy: workers were expendable resources, like lumber or concrete. When James fell from that scaffolding, Whitman's first concern wasn't the injured man's family, it was liability limitation. Within hours of the accident, corporate lawyers were already crafting the narrative that would minimize payout and shift blame. The workers' compensation system was Whitman's masterpiece of legal manipulation. On paper it looked generous: medical coverage, disability payments, rehabilitation support. In reality, it was a maze of bureaucratic dead ends designed to exhaust claimants until they gave up or accepted settlements that barely covered their debts. Whitman had refined this process across hundreds of cases. turning human suffering into quarterly profit reports. But Whitman's cruelty extended beyond his own employees. His corporate tentacles reached into every aspect of working-class life. The corner store where James would soon stand, desperate, belonged to Whitman's retail chain, a network of shops, strategically placed in poor neighborhoods where they could charge premium prices for basic necessities. Baby formula that cost $12 in the suburbs sold for $18 in these convenience stores, exploiting parents who had no transportation to shop elsewhere. The housing complex that had evicted James, owned by another Whitman subsidiary, the employment agencies that had rejected his applications, they received kickbacks for steering undesirable candidates away from Whitman-connected businesses. This wasn't coincidence, it was systematic. Economic warfare against the working class. Whitman's monthly board meetings featured PowerPoint presentations celebrating their success in optimizing labor costs and maximizing market penetration. In underserved communities, what they were really celebrating was their ability to push families like James's into impossible situations, then profit from their desperation. The surveillance cameras in that corner store weren't just security measures, they were data collection tools, recording every interaction to identify opportunities for further exploitation. When desperate parents lingered too long in the baby food aisle, algorithms flagged them for predatory lending offers and overpriced insurance policies. But Charles Whitman had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that poverty would break people's spirits completely, that desperation would eliminate human dignity and compassion. He never considered that sometimes, in the darkest moments, ordinary people discover extraordinary strength. The moment James Rivera's trembling hand reached for that formula can, he crossed an invisible threshold that the system had been designed to create. This wasn't spontaneous desperation, it was the predictable outcome of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy his family's stability. Earlier that day, James had received the final piece of devastating news. His disability claim had been reassessed by Whitman Holdings' insurance subsidiary and deemed no longer qualifying for benefits. The medical review, conducted by a doctor who had never examined James, concluded that his injuries were insufficient to prevent alternative employment opportunities. The timing wasn't coincidental. It came exactly 1 week before Thanksgiving, when families were most vulnerable and most desperate. The letter arrived with corporate efficiency, delivered by a courier who apologized with genuine sympathy. It explained that James owed $2,847 in overpaid benefits that needed to be returned within 30 days. The same money he'd used to buy food for Tommy, to pay for the medicine that managed his chronic pain, to keep their electricity turned on. All of it was now classified as debt. But the cruelest twist was yet to come. The letter included a job placement offer through Whitman's vocational rehabilitation program. The position, night shift security guard at the same construction site where he'd been injured, walking past the exact spot where his life had been destroyed, for $8.50 an hour with no benefits. The message was clear: we own your past, your present, and your future. James had called the customer service number 17 times that day. Each call lasted exactly 4 minutes before being transferred to another department. Another representative, another scripted apology that led nowhere. The system had been perfected to exhaust complainants, to make them give up before they could navigate the deliberately complex appeals process. By 11:30 p.m., James sat in his car outside the corner store, staring at the $3.47 in his wallet. Tommy had been crying for hours, hunger gnawing at his tiny stomach. The formula in that store cost $17.99, money that might as well have been $1 million. James had built skyscrapers with his bare hands, but he couldn't solve the simple problem of feeding his child. The security cameras recorded every second of his internal struggle. Whitman's data analysts would later study this footage, using it to refine their psychological pressure tactics. They measured the exact moment when dignity breaks, when desperation overrides moral conditioning, when good people are forced to consider actions they never thought possible. As James finally pushed through those glass doors, he was walking into more than just a store. He was entering the final stage of a systematic destruction that had been months in the making, orchestrated by people who would never know his name, but had calculated his breaking point with mathematical precision. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James stood frozen in aisle 3, the formula can heavy in his hands like a weight of moral compromise. His reflection in the security mirror showed a man he barely recognized, hollow cheeks, desperate eyes, the posture of someone who had been systematically broken by forces beyond his control. But across the counter, another father was watching, with recognition that cut through the store's artificial lighting. Miguel Santos, 38 years old, had been working double shifts at this corner store for 14 months. Not by choice, but because his wife Maria had been diagnosed with lupus, and their insurance, the bare minimum coverage his employer provided, wouldn't cover her medication. Miguel's own 2 children, ages 5 and 7, had learned to fall asleep to the sound of their father's absence. Coming home from school to find notes instead of parent hugs. As Miguel watched James struggle with a decision that no parent should ever face, memories flooded back. 6 months ago, Miguel had stood in a pharmacy at 2 a.m., calculating whether he could afford both his wife's pain medication and his daughter's asthma inhaler. The choice between his wife's suffering and his child's breathing. He'd chosen the inhaler and spent the night holding Maria as she cried from joint pain that felt like fire in her bones. The security camera's red light blinked steadily, but Miguel knew something the corporate overlords didn't understand. Surveillance can record actions, but it can't capture the weight of moral courage. In that moment, watching James's internal struggle, Miguel made a decision that would ripple far beyond a single transaction. Instead of following protocol, calling his manager, threatening to call security, protecting his minimum wage job, Miguel walked around the counter. His footsteps echoed in the empty store as he approached James, who tensed, expecting confrontation, judgment, another reminder of his failure as a provider. But Miguel's voice, when it came, carried the weight of shared understanding. How old is your child? The question shattered James's carefully constructed emotional walls. 3, he whispered, the word breaking like glass. He's 3 years old, and he's hungry, and the sentence died in his throat. Shame and desperation battling for control. Nodded, recognizing the specific exhaustion of a parent pushed beyond their limits. He'd seen it in his own mirror countless times. My daughter is 5. Same formula brand. I know exactly how much it costs, and exactly how impossible that number becomes. When you're choosing between feeding your child and keeping your lights on, what happened next would be captured by those security cameras, but the corporate analysts reviewing the footage would never understand its true significance. They would see violation of company policy, inappropriate employee behavior, a breach of profit protection protocols, but they wouldn't see the moment when two fathers, trapped in the same systematic oppression, chose solidarity over self-preservation. What Miguel did next wasn't just an act of kindness. It was an act of quiet rebellion that would expose the entire system designed to pit struggling families against each other. Wait here, Miguel told James, his voice steady with newfound purpose. He walked to the back office, where the store's computer system hummed with data that corporate headquarters monitored in real. But Miguel had learned something during his 14 months of double shifts. The system tracked transactions, but it couldn't track human intention. Miguel pulled up the inventory management screen and began documenting something that would later become evidence of systematic price manipulation. The baby formula that cost $17.99 in this store was selling for $11.49 at the suburban location just 12 miles away. The same exact product, same brand, same size, marked up 60% in a neighborhood where the median income was 40% lower. But that wasn't all. Miguel's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, accessing shipping records that told an even darker story. The formula expired in 3 weeks, meaning it had been sitting in corporate warehouses for months before being shipped to this location. The suburban stores received fresh inventory while poor neighborhoods got the products approaching expiration at premium prices. As he gathered this information, Miguel's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Miguel, the pharmacy called. Insurance denied Maria's prescription again. They want $340 for this month's medication. The timing felt like the universe confirming what he already knew. This wasn't about one desperate father or one overpriced can of formula. This was about a system designed to extract maximum profit from maximum human suffering. Miguel screenshotted everything. The pricing disparities, the expiration date manipulation, the inventory distribution patterns that revealed how corporate algorithms decided which communities deserved fresh products and which deserved expired ones at inflated prices. Each image was evidence of what financial experts would later call poverty taxation, the systematic overcharging of people who had the least ability to pay. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. In the employee portal, Miguel discovered internal communications about loss prevention protocols and high-risk demographics. The corporate language was sanitized, but the meaning was clear: assume theft, maximize surveillance, and create an atmosphere of suspicion around customers who looked like they couldn't afford to be there. The final piece of documentation came from the security system itself. Miguel accessed the camera logs and found something that made his blood run cold. Dozens of incidents like James's situation, recorded and archived, parents caught between dignity and desperation, their most vulnerable moments cataloged by corporate surveillance and used to refine psychological pressure tactics. As Miguel printed out page after page of evidence, James stood in aisle 3, unaware that his personal crisis was about to become the catalyst for exposing a multi-billion-dollar exploitation scheme. The security camera's red light continued blinking, recording what it thought was simple employee theft prevention, but it was actually documenting the moment when systematic oppression finally met systematic resistance. Miguel returned to the counter with more than just compassion. He carried a plan that would transform individual desperation into collective action. As he rang up the formula, his fingers moved deliberately across the register, entering a manager override code that would later become crucial evidence. "This is on me," Miguel told James, handing him the formula, along with something unexpected, a business card for Legal Aid Society and a folded piece of paper. "But there's something bigger happening here that you need to know about." The paper contained a phone number and a name: Sarah Chen, investigative reporter for the Metropolitan Tribune, who had been researching corporate exploitation in low-income communities. Miguel had been feeding her information for weeks, building a case that would expose the systematic price manipulation affecting thousands of families. But tonight's encounter with James had crystallized something crucial. They needed a human face for the story, someone whose experience could illustrate the real-world impact of corporate greed. James's construction background, his injury, his systematic exclusion from employment, it was the perfect case study of how multiple forms of exploitation worked together to destroy working families. "Sarah's been investigating Whitman Holdings for 6 months, Miguel explained, his voice low but urgent. "Price manipulation, employment discrimination, insurance fraud, it's all connected. Your case could be the key that unlocks everything." As James listened, Miguel laid out the bigger picture. The corner store wasn't just overcharging for baby formula, it was part of a network of businesses that created what economists call poverty traps. High prices in poor neighborhoods, limited transportation options, predatory lending, employment, discrimination, each element reinforced the others, creating a cycle that was nearly impossible to escape. Miguel had been documenting this system for months, but he'd been waiting for the right moment to act. His wife's medical bills, his children's needs, his own job security, everything depended on maintaining the status quo. But watching James face the same impossible choices had shattered Miguel's ability to stay silent. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. James would contact Sarah Chen in Legal Aid Society, sharing his story and the documentation Miguel had gathered. Meanwhile, Miguel would continue collecting evidence from inside the system, using his access to corporate databases to expose the full scope of the exploitation. But they had to move fast. Corporate algorithms monitored employee behavior, flagging unusual transaction patterns and system access. Miguel's activities that night had probably already triggered automated alerts. They had maybe 48 hours before security protocols locked down his access and potentially cost him his job. As James left the store with formula for Tommy and a folder full of evidence, neither man fully understood what they had set in motion. By tomorrow morning, their quiet act of solidarity would begin unraveling a corporate conspiracy that reached into every aspect of working-class life. The security cameras captured James's exit, but they couldn't record the most important transaction of the night: the exchange of hope for desperation, the transformation of individual suffering into collective power. 40-8 hours later, Sarah Chun's front-page expose hit the Metropolitan Tribune with the force of a demolition blast. The headline read, "The Poverty Tax: How Corporate Giants Systematically Exploits Working Families." But it was the accompanying photo that stopped the city cold. James Rivera holding his 3-year-old son Tommy, standing in front of the construction site where his life had been shattered. The article didn't just tell James's story. It connected his experience to a massive data analysis that Miguel's evidence had made possible. Using the internal documents and pricing records, financial experts had calculated that Whitman Holdings was extracting an estimated $47 million annually from low-income communities through price manipulation alone. Baby formula, diapers, basic groceries all marked up 40 to 60% in neighborhoods where families could least afford the increase. By 8 a.m., Sarah's investigative team had published the smoking gun: internal corporate emails discussing demographic-based pricing strategies and loss leader elimination in low-value markets. The language was sanitized corporate speak, but the meaning was crystal clear. They were deliberately overcharging poor families because they knew those families had no alternatives. The story exploded across social media within hours. #Pop began trending as thousands of parents shared their own experiences of impossible choices, of paying premium prices for basic necessities, of being trapped in economic cycles designed to benefit corporate shareholders at the expense of working families. But Charles Whitman's response revealed the true arrogance of unchecked corporate power. Instead of addressing the allegations, Whitman Holdings issued a statement attacking James personally, questioning his work ethic, suggesting his injury was exaggerated, implying that his poverty was a result of personal failings rather than systematic exploitation. The statement was a catastrophic miscalculation. By attacking James, a decorated construction worker, injured veteran, devoted father, Whitman had given human faces to corporate greed. The public backlash was immediate and fierce. By noon, protesters had gathered outside Whitman Holdings headquarters, led by construction workers, retail employees, and parents carrying signs that read, "Our children's hunger equals your profit margin." And James Rivera built this city. You broke his family. The legal ramifications moved even faster. By 2 p.m., the state attorney general had announced a formal investigation into price manipulation and employment discrimination. Class action lawyers filed suits representing thousands of affected families. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry into fraudulent business practices. Miguel watched the coverage from his living room, his wife Maria beside him, both of them understanding that their lives had been irreversibly changed. Miguel's managers had terminated him that morning, citing policy violations. But Legal Aid Society had already taken his case, preparing wrongful termination charges. As news vans surrounded the corner store and reporters interviewed customers about their experiences with inflated prices, the security cameras that had once been tools of oppression became witnesses to justice. Every recorded transaction, every documented price manipulation, every algorithmic decision to exploit vulnerable families, it was all evidenced now. By sunset, Whitman's stock had dropped 23%, wiping out $2.8 billion in market value. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the moment when systematic oppression finally met systematic resistance. When individual desperation transformed into collective power. 6 months after that desperate night in Aisle 3, the courtroom was packed as federal Judge Patricia Williams read the verdict that would reshape corporate accountability forever. Whitman Holdings was found guilty on 14 counts of systematic fraud, price manipulation, and employment discrimination. The $847 million settlement was the largest consumer protection judgment in state history, but the numbers only told part of the story. Charles Whitman, once untouchable behind layers of corporate protection, sat in handcuffs as federal marshals, prepared to escort him to begin his 8-year prison sentence. His empire of exploitation had crumbled in spectacular fashion, with subsidiary companies shuttered, assets liquidated, and executives facing their own criminal charges. The corner store, where it all began, had been transformed into something unprecedented, a community-owned cooperative, where prices were set by neighborhood residents, not corporate algorithms. Miguel Santos, vindicated by wrongful termination lawsuits, now managed the store as part of a network of worker-owned businesses spreading across the city. James Rivera stood before the courthouse steps. Tommy, now 4 years old and healthy, addressing a crowd of families whose lives had been changed by their courage to speak truth to power. His back injury would never fully heal, but the settlement had provided comprehensive medical care and job retraining that respected his skills and experience. This was never about one can of formula, James told the gathered reporters and supporters. This was about a system that convinced us we deserved to struggle, that our poverty was our fault, that we should be grateful for crumbs while others feast on our desperation. The legal victory had cascaded into broader social change. The James Rivera Act legislation requiring price transparency and prohibiting demographic-based pricing discrimination had passed with bipartisan support. Similar laws were being considered in 12 other states, creating a nationwide movement against poverty, taxation. Miguel's documentation had revealed the full scope of corporate exploitation, leading to investigations of dozens of other companies using similar tactics. The evidence he'd gathered that night, screenshots taken while his wife suffered without medication, while his children fell asleep to his absence, had become the foundation for the largest corporate accountability case in decades. Maria Santos's lupus treatment was now fully covered by the comprehensive health care plan that Miguel's new position provided. Their children, ages 6 and 8, had learned that their father was more than a night shift worker. He was a man who had risked everything to defend families like their own. The security cameras that had once monitored and exploited vulnerable families now served a different purpose, documenting the community meetings, the cooperative planning sessions, the grassroots organizing that had grown from one moment of human connection. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Families throughout the city no longer accepted poverty as personal failure. They understood that their struggles were not individual shortcomings but systematic obstacles designed to benefit others. That knowledge had transformed victims into advocates, desperation into determination. Today, 18 months after that life-changing night, James Rivera runs a construction cooperative that employs 47 formerly injured workers, building affordable housing in the same neighborhoods where Whitman Holdings once extracted maximum profit. Tommy, now 5 years old, plays in the community garden behind the cooperative store, surrounded by children whose families were lifted out of poverty by the systematic changes that began with one father's desperate choice. Miguel Santos has become a national advocate for worker rights, traveling to cities across America where communities are organizing against corporate exploitation. His wife Maria's lupus is in remission, her medical bills covered by the comprehensive health care that the cooperative movement has made possible. Their children understand that their father didn't just work night shifts, he helped reshape the relationship between corporate power and human dignity. The corner store has become a symbol of transformation that economists study and communities replicate. Where price manipulation once extracted wealth from struggling families, community ownership now invests profits back into education, healthcare, and local economic development. The security cameras still record every transaction, but now they document equity rather than exploitation. This story reveals a fundamental truth that corporate boardrooms desperately want us to forget. Individual acts of compassion can become collective movements for justice. When Miguel chose solidarity over self-preservation, when James chose courage over shame, they proved that ordinary people possess extraordinary power to challenge systematic oppression. But here's what the wealthy elites fear most. This story is not unique. Across America, families are facing the same impossible choices, the same systematic exploitation, the same corporate indifference to human suffering. Your neighbor struggling to afford medicine, your coworker choosing between rent and groceries, your community being drained by predatory pricing and employment discrimination. The only difference between James Rivera's family and millions of others is that his story found its voice, his desperation found its witness, his courage found its platform. If you made it to the end of this story, you're part of the 3% who understand that individual struggles are connected to systematic problems, that personal responsibility must be balanced with corporate accountability. Comment, justice served, if this story reminded you that change is possible when people choose solidarity over silence. By subscribing to this channel, you're not just following stories, you're supporting the documentation of how ordinary people challenge extraordinary injustice. Every subscription sends a message that human dignity matters more than corporate profits. Share this story because someone in your community needs to know that their struggles are not their fault, that their desperation is not destiny, that their courage can become catalyst for change. Remember this truth. The system that convinces you that poverty is personal failure is the same system that profits from your desperation. But when compassion meets courage, the impossible becomes inevitable.